Officer Sebastian, blinded by prejudice, arrests a 5-year-old black girl named Mia. But 10 minutes later, karma strikes, unraveling his career in ways he never expected. Will he confront his own biases, or will the fallout from this moment destroy everything he's worked for? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Sebastian gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car, his knuckles turning white. The morning shift had been a nightmare. One call after another, each more frustrating than the last. He let out a heavy sigh, feeling the weight of his badge pressing down on him. Just a few more hours, he muttered to himself. Then I can go home and forget about all this. As he drove through the bustling city streets, Sebastian's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart. The world seemed to be changing too fast, and he struggled to keep up. Back in my day, people respected the law, he thought bitterly. Now everyone's got an opinion on how we do our job. Sebastian had been on the force for over 20 years. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. But lately, things felt different. The way people looked at him, the whispers he heard as he walked by. It made his skin crawl. I'm one of the good guys, he insisted to himself. I'm here to protect and serve. Why can't they see that? As he approached the predominantly black neighborhood on his beat, Sebastian felt his jaw clench. This area always made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but something about it set him on edge. Just need to get through this day without any more problems, he thought. No protests, no complaints, no trouble. Just a nice, quiet afternoon. Sebastian's eyes darted from side to side, scanning the streets for any sign of danger. He saw a group of young men standing on a corner, laughing and talking. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster. They're probably up to no good, he thought. Always are in this neighborhood. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, Sebastian felt a twinge of guilt. He knew he shouldn't think that way. He'd been to all the sensitivity trainings, sat through all the lectures about bias, but old habits died hard. I treat everyone the same, he reassured himself. I'm fair. I'm just doing my job. But deep down, a small voice nagged at him. Was he really as fair as he claimed to be? Sebastian pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the road ahead. As he turned onto the next street, Sebastian saw a young boy, no more than 10 years old, riding his bike on the sidewalk. For a moment, he was reminded of his own son at that age, carefree and innocent. Things were simpler then, Sebastian thought with a touch of sadness. When did everything get so complicated? Sebastian's eyes narrowed as he spotted a small figure on the curb near the park. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, sat alone, quietly playing with a worn-out doll. Her dark curls bounced as she moved the toy back and forth, lost in her own world. What's a kid that young doing out here alone? Sebastian muttered under his breath. His mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusions. Abandoned? Neglected? Or worse, with someone who put other kids in danger. Without a second thought, Sebastian pulled his patrol car to the side of the road. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was typical for this neighborhood. How many times had he seen black children left unattended, their parents nowhere in sight? Sebastian stepped out of his car, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He marched towards the little girl, his face set in a stern expression. "Hey you," he called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Where are your parents?" The little girl looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. Her big brown eyes widened with fear as she saw the towering police officer approaching. She clutched her doll tighter to her chest, as if it could protect her. I... She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian cut her off before she could finish. "Speak up. Where's your mom or dad? You shouldn't be out here alone." The girl's lower lip trembled. She tried to speak again, but Sebastian's harsh tone made the words catch in her throat. Tears began to well up in her eyes. This is exactly what's wrong with this neighborhood, Sebastian thought, his frustration growing. No one takes responsibility. These kids are left to fend for themselves. He towered over the little girl, his shadow falling across her small frame. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Where do you live?" The girl hugged her doll even tighter, shrinking away from Sebastian's imposing figure. She looked around frantically, as if searching for someone. Sebastian's patience was wearing thin. He reached for his radio, ready to call for backup. "If you won't tell me where your parents are, I'll have to take you to the station," he threatened. The tension in the air was palpable. The little girl's eyes darted back and forth, filled with confusion and fear. Sebastian stood rigid, his hand on his radio, waiting for a response that didn't come. As Mia's eyes filled with tears, her small body trembled. She hugged her doll tighter, trying to find comfort in its familiar softness. Sebastian's harsh words and towering presence overwhelmed her, and she struggled to find her voice. Nearby, a few neighbors noticed the commotion. They recognized Mia, the sweet little girl who often played in the park with her father. Concern etched on their faces. They began to approach. "Hey, what's going on here?" called out Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived across the street. She hurried over as fast as her aging legs would allow. "Officer, that's Mia. Her daddy's just around the corner," explained Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man who had been walking his dog. Sebastian's jaw clenched. He felt his control of the situation slipping away. "Step back, folks. This is police business," he barked, his voice rising. But the crowd grew larger and more voices joined in. "Her father's a good man. He works at the community center," someone shouted. "She's not alone. We all look out for each other here," added another neighbor. Sebastian's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He couldn't back down now. "I said step back," he yelled, his hand moving to his belt. The tension in the air thickened. Mia whimpered, her little shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ignoring the pleas of the neighbors, Sebastian reached down and roughly grabbed Mia's arm. "Come on, kid. You're coming with me until we sort this out," he growled. Mia cried out in pain and fear, her doll falling to the ground. "Daddy!" she wailed, her voice breaking. The crowd erupted in outrage. "Let her go! You're hurting her. This isn't right." Several people pulled out their phones, their cameras pointed at Sebastian and the terrified little girl. The clicks and beeps of recording devices filled the air. "You can't do this," Mrs. Johnson cried, her voice shaking with emotion. "She's just a child." But Sebastian was too far gone. His grip on Mia's arm tightened as he started to pull her towards his patrol car. The little girl stumbled, tears streaming down her face. The neighbors' voices grew louder, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Sebastian's heart raced, sweat beading on his forehead. He knew he was in too deep, but he couldn't back down now, not in front of all these people. As he dragged Mia along, her cries pierced the air, a sound that would haunt everyone present for a long time to come. Sebastian's heart pounded as he faced the growing crowd. Their angry shouts and accusing glares made him feel cornered. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he reached for his baton, pulling it out with a swift motion. "Stay back," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "This is police business." The crowd gasped, their faces a mix of shock and horror. Mia's cries grew louder, her small body shaking uncontrollably. Sebastian's hands trembled as he reached for his handcuffs, the cold metal glinting in the afternoon sun. "Please don't do this," Mrs. Johnson pleaded, her eyes brimming with tears. But Sebastian was too far gone. He snapped the handcuffs around Mia's tiny wrists, the sound of the metal clicking shut echoing in the tense air. Mia's wails intensified, her face streaked with tears and fear. "Daddy, I want my daddy," she sobbed, her voice breaking. Sebastian Rukli lifted Mia, carrying her towards his squad car. Her legs kicked weakly as she struggled against his grip. The crowd's shouts grew louder, their phonies still recording every terrible moment. Mr. Thompson, unable to stand by any longer, stepped forward. "This isn't right," he yelled, moving toward Sebastian. Sebastian whirled around, his baton raised threateningly. "Back off," he snarled, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and anger. Mr. Thompson froze, his hands raised in surrender. The other onlookers held their breath, the tension palpable. With Mia still crying in his arms, Sebastian fumbled with the car door, finally managing to open it. He placed her in the back seat, her small form looking even tinier against the large, dark interior. "Stop! You can't take her," someone shouted from the crowd. "This is wrong!" another voice joined in. But Sebastian ignored them all. He slammed the car door shut, Mia's muffled cries still audible from inside. He rushed to the driver's side, his movements jerky and panicked. As he started the engine, the crowd surged forward, their voices rising in a cacophony of anger and disbelief. Sebastian's eyes darted around, taking in the sea of furious faces surrounding his car. Without another word, he stepped on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as he pulled away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a stunned, horrified group of neighbors. As Sebastian drove off with Mia, the sound of her heartbreaking sobs filled the car. The chaos of the scene faded into the distance, but the weight of what he'd done settled heavily on Sebastian's shoulders. Yet he pressed on, oblivious to the storm he was leaving in his wake. Sebastian marched into the station, his grip firm on Mia's small shoulder. The little girl's sobs echoed through the hallway, drawing curious glances from other officers. Sebastian's jaw clenched as he steered her towards the processing area, convinced he was following protocol. "It's okay, sweetie," he said gruffly, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll figure this out." Mia's cries only grew louder, her tiny body shaking with each breath. Sebastian felt a twinge of discomfort but pushed it aside. He had a job to do after all. At the desk, Officer Willow looked up, his eyebrows rising at the sight of the distraught child. "What's going on here, Sebastian?" "Found her alone at the park," Sebastian explained, his voice clipped. "No parents in sight, bringing her in for her own safety." Willow's eyes narrowed, but he nodded slowly. "All right, let's get her processed then." As Sebastian began filling out the paperwork, Mia's wails intensified. She hiccuped between sobs, her small hands still bound by the handcuffs. "I want my daddy," she cried, her voice raw with fear. Sebastian's pen paused mid-sentence. For the first time since the park, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Was this really necessary? He glanced at Mia, taking in her tear-stained face and trembling lips. Before he could dwell on these thoughts, the station door burst open with a bang. Sebastian's head snapped up, his eyes widening as a tall, imposing man strode in. The newcomer's face was a mask of controlled fury, his eyes blazing as they locked onto Sebastian. "Daddy!" Mia cried out, her voice a mix of relief and lingering fear. The man, Ben, Sebastian realized with a sinking feeling, approached the desk. His steps were measured, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. Yet, when he spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "Officer," Ben said, his gaze never leaving Sebastian's face, "I believe you have my daughter." Sebastian swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the weight of his actions. The certainty he'd felt earlier evaporated, leaving him feeling exposed and unsure. "Sir, Sebastian began, but Ben cut him off with a raised hand. "Remove those handcuffs from my child. Now." Ben's voice was low, but the command in it was unmistakable. With fumbling fingers, Sebastian complied, releasing Mia from the restraints. The moment she was free, she ran to her father, burying her face in his legs as fresh tears fell. Ben knelt down, gathering Mia in his arms. "It's okay, baby," he murmured, his voice softening as he spoke to his daughter. "Daddy's here now." As Ben stood back up, Mia cradled safely in his arms, he fixed Sebastian with a look that made the officer's blood run cold. The fury in Ben's eyes was palpable, but it was the disappointment and hurt that truly shook Sebastian to his core. Ben stood tall, his presence commanding the room. With Mia still clinging to him, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His eyes never left Sebastian's face as he tapped the screen. "Officer Sebastian," Ben said, his voice steady but laced with controlled anger. "I'd like you to watch something." He held out the phone and Sebastian reluctantly took it. The video began to play, showing the scene at the park from earlier. Sebastian's stomach churned as he watched himself approach Mia, his actions seeming far harsher on screen than he remembered. The footage showed him roughly grabbing Mia's arm, ignoring the pleas of the gathered crowd. Sebastian winced as he heard Mia's cries, louder and more heart-wrenching than he'd realized at the time. As the video ended, Sebastian looked up, his face pale. Ben's ease bored into him, waiting for a response. I was just following protocol, Sebastian stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. The child was alone, and I thought— You thought wrong, Ben interrupted, his voice low and controlled. What you did was not protocol. It was an abuse of power. Sebastian felt his defenses rising. Now wait a minute, he began, his tone growing argumentative. You don't understand the pressures we face out there. I was trying to protect— Protect? Ben cut him off again, his eyebrow raised. You were protecting no one. You traumatized a 5-year-old girl who was playing peacefully near her home. Sebastian's jaw clenched. He looked around the station hoping for support from his fellow officers, but found only uncomfortable glances and averted eyes. Listen, Sebastian tried again. I was doing my job. Sometimes we have to make quick decisions in the field. If you'd just let me explain. I'm not interested in your explanations, Officer Sebastian, Ben said firmly. What I'm interested in is accountability. Your actions today were not just wrong, they were dangerous and potentially illegal. Sebastian felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. You don't know what it's like out there, he muttered, a last attempt at justification. Ben's eyes flashed. No, officer, it's you who doesn't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to fear for your child's safety, not because of criminals, but because of those sworn to protect them. Ben wasted no time. With a determined look in his eyes, he pulled out his phone and began making calls. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he fired off text messages and emails. I'm filing a formal complaint right now, Ben announced, his voice firm and unwavering. He turned to Sebastian, who stood frozen in place. This isn't over, officer. Not by a long shot. Within minutes, Ben's legal team was mobilized. They arrived at the station in a flurry of activity, briefcases in hand and stern expressions on their faces. The quiet police station suddenly buzzed with tension. Sebastian watched helplessly as Ben spoke in hushed tones with his lawyers. He felt a knot forming in his stomach, a growing sense of dread creeping over him. Just then, Sebastian's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a flood of notifications. Social media was exploding with the news. The video of him manhandling Mia had gone viral, shared thousands of times in mere minutes. As if on cue, the station's phones began ringing off the hook. The desk sergeant looked overwhelmed, frantically trying to field calls from angry citizens and persistent reporters. Sebastian's palms began to sweat. He loosened his collar, feeling suffocated. The gravity of the situation was finally sinking in. Suddenly, the station doors burst open. A swarm of journalists poured in, cameras flashing and microphones extended. They shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusation and demand. Officer Sebastian, what do you have to say about the video? Is it true you arrested a 5-year-old girl? How do you respond to allegations of racial profiling? Sebastian stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the onslaught. He looked around desperately for support, but his fellow officers kept their distance, their faces a mix of shock and disappointment. Just then, the commanding officer strode in, his face set in a grim expression. He took in the chaotic scene before fixing Sebastian with a hard stare. My office now, he barked, cutting through the noise. As Sebastian followed his superior, he could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him. The cameras continued to flash, capturing his every move. He felt exposed, vulnerable, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Ben watched Sebastian disappear into the office, his face a mask of determination. He turned to his daughter, who was still clinging to him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. It's okay, sweetheart, he said softly, stroking her hair. Daddy's going to make sure this never happens again. To anyone. The commanding officer's face paled as he watched the news report on the small television in his office. He quickly strode out, his eyes scanning the bustling station until they landed on Ben and Mia. With a heavy sigh, he approached them. Mr. Cully, he addressed Ben, his voice filled with genuine regret. I want to extend my deepest apologies for what happened to your daughter. This is not how we train our officers to behave, and I assure you, We will take immediate action. Ben nodded stiffly, his arm protectively wrapped around Mia's small shoulders. The commanding officer knelt down to Mia's level, his face softening. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. You must have been very scared. We're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Mia buried her face in her father's side, still too shaken to respond. The commanding officer stood up, his face hardening as he turned to face Sebastian, who had just emerged from the office. Officer Sebastian, he said, his voice stern and authoritative. You are hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into this incident. Turn in your badge and gun. Sebastian's world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at his commanding officer in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Slowly, as if in a daze, he unclipped his badge and removed his gun from its holster, placing them on a nearby desk. The gravity of the situation hit Sebastian like a ton of bricks. He watched as his colleagues averted their eyes, some shaking their heads in disappointment. The career he had built over years was crumbling before him in a matter of minutes. Outside, the media storm continued to rage. Reporters pressed their faces against the station windows, cameras flashing incessantly. Sebastian could hear their muffled shouts, demanding answers, calling for justice. As he stood there, feeling more alone than he ever had, Sebastian's eyes drifted to Mia. Her small frame was still pressed against her father, her face tear-streaked and frightened. The image seared itself into his mind, and for the first time since the incident began, doubt crept into his thoughts. Had he really been in the right? The certainty he had felt earlier began to waver. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had been so sure, so convinced of his authority and judgment. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, Sebastian began to question everything he thought he knew. Sebastian sat on his worn leather couch, his eyes glued to the television screen. The news anchor's voice filled his small living room, each word like a dagger to his heart. Officer Sebastian, now suspended from duty, is facing severe backlash after forcibly detaining a 5-year-old girl in what many are calling a clear case of racial profiling. He watched as his own face flashed across the screen, a still image from the body cam footage that had been released. Sebastian barely recognized himself. The stern, authoritative expression he wore seemed alien now. The story continued, showing clips of protesters outside the police station, their signs demanding justice for Mia. Sebastian's stomach churned as he saw Mia's tearful face, her father Ben standing protectively beside her during a press conference. We trusted the police to protect our community, Ben's voice rang out, steady and determined. Instead, they traumatized an innocent child. This has to stop. Sebastian's phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table. He glanced at it, seeing a flood of notifications. Some were from news outlets seeking comment, but most were from numbers he didn't recognize. With a shaky hand, he picked up the phone and opened one of the messages. You're a disgrace to the badge, it read. How do you sleep at night? Another buzzed in. Racist pig. I hope you never work again. The messages kept coming, each one more hateful than the last. Sebastian's vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. He tossed the phone aside, unable to bear reading anymore. His landline rang, cutting through the silence. For a moment, hope fluttered in his chest. Maybe it was his partner, checking in on him, or his sister, offering support. He answered quickly. Hello? Is this Officer Sebastian? A gruff voice asked. Yes, this is... You should be ashamed of yourself, the voice yelled before the line went dead. Sebastian slumped back onto the couch, feeling more alone than ever. He thought of calling his friends, seeking some comfort or understanding. But as he scrolled through his contacts, he realized most of them had already distanced themselves. His best friend's last message read, I need some time to process this. Please don't contact me for a while. Even his family seemed to be pulling away. His sister's usually chatty social media had gone silent about him, and his parents hadn't returned his calls. Left alone with his thoughts, Sebastian's mind raced. The certainty he had felt during the incident now seemed like a distant memory. In its place, guilt and confusion swirled. creating a storm of emotions he couldn't escape. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was Mia's frightened face. The sound of her cries echoed in his ears. How had he gotten it so wrong? He had been so sure he was doing the right thing, protecting a child he thought was in danger. But now, replaying the incident in his mind, he began to see the flaws in his judgment, the biases that had clouded his perception. Sebastian sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. The ticking of the clock seemed to echo in the silent apartment, each second a reminder of how his life had unraveled in just a few days. As he sipped his cold coffee, memories from his years on the force began to flood his mind. He thought back to a traffic stop he'd made last year, a young black man in a nice car. Sebastian had been certain something was off, convinced the car must have been stolen. He'd called for backup before even approaching the vehicle. It turned out the man was a successful entrepreneur, driving his own car. Sebastian had apologized, but now he wondered, why had he jumped to that conclusion? Another memory surfaced, this time of a noise complaint in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. He'd arrived on the scene, already assuming it was a wild party getting out of hand. Instead, he'd found a family celebration for a quinceañera. The family had been confused and hurt by his aggressive approach. These incidents, which he'd dismissed at the time as simple misunderstandings, now took on a new, troubling light. Sebastian felt a knot forming in his stomach as he began to see a pattern in his behavior. "Have I always been like this?" he whispered to himself, his voice cracking with emotion. He thought about his training at the academy, how proud he'd been to put on the uniform for the first time. He'd sworn to protect and serve all citizens equally. But had he really lived up to that oath? Sebastian's mind wandered to conversations with his partner, times when they'd made offhand comments about certain neighborhoods or groups of people. At the time, it had seemed harmless, just part of the job. Now those words felt heavy with prejudice. Tears welled up in Sebastian's eyes as the weight of his realizations bore down on him. He'd always seen himself as a good cop, fair and just. But now, he was forced to confront the possibility that he'd been carrying biases he'd never wanted to acknowledge. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered, burying his face in his hands. The image of Mia's frightened face flashed in his mind again, but this time, it was accompanied by the faces of countless others he may have misjudged over the years. The enormity of his actions, not just in this incident but throughout his career, began to dawn on him. Sebastian felt lost, adrift in a sea of doubt and self-recrimination. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his job, and his place in the world was suddenly in question. The emotional turmoil deepened, leaving him feeling hollow and uncertain about who he really was and what he stood for. Sebastian's hands trembled as he dialed Ben's number for the 5th time that week. Once again, the call went straight to voicemail. He sighed heavily, setting the phone down on his coffee table. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "I have to do something," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. After a moment of quiet reflection, Sebastian made a decision. He grabbed his laptop and began searching for local community meetings. His heart raced as he found one scheduled for that evening at a nearby church. When Sebastian arrived at the meeting, he felt like all eyes were on him. The room fell silent as he walked in, his presence clearly unexpected. He took a seat in the back, trying to make himself as small as possible. The meeting began, and Sebastian listened intently as community members shared their experiences with law enforcement. Stories of fear, mistrust, and unfair treatment filled the air. Each word hit Sebastian like a punch to the gut, forcing him to confront the reality of his profession's impact on Black families. One mother spoke about teaching her young son how to behave during a police encounter, her voice cracking with emotion. "I shouldn't have to fear for my child's life every time he leaves the house," she said. Sebastian felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of his own son, how he'd never had to have such a conversation with him. The stark difference in their experiences was eye-opening. As the meeting progressed, Sebastian found the courage to raise his hand. When called upon, he stood up, his legs shaky. I'm a police officer," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The room tensed. "I'm here because I want to learn. I've made mistakes and I want to do better." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, an older gentleman in the front row spoke up. "It takes guts to admit that. We appreciate you being here, officer." Sebastian nodded gratefully, feeling a small spark of hope. As he continued to attend meetings over the next few weeks, he began to see the world through a different lens. He learned about the history of policing in Black communities, the impact of racial profiling, and the deep-rooted fears many Black parents carried. Slowly, the community began to warm up to Sebastian's presence. They saw his genuine desire to learn and change. He started to form connections, listening more than he spoke, absorbing the stories and experiences shared. With each meeting, Sebastian felt his perspective shifting. The systemic issues he'd been blind to for so long were now impossible to ignore. He realized that his actions as a police officer had been part of a much larger problem, one that couldn't be solved with a simple apology. As Sebastian continued attending community meetings and learning about the experiences of Black families, his guilt grew heavier. Each story he heard reminded him of his encounter with Mia and the pain he had caused her and her family. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, Sebastian approached the community center director. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked, his voice filled with sincerity. The director looked at him thoughtfully. "We could always use more volunteers for our youth programs," she said. "Are you interested?" Sebastian nodded eagerly. "Yes, I'd like that very much." The next day, Sebastian found himself at the community center, surrounded by children of all ages. At first, the kids were wary of him, knowing he was a police officer. But as he helped with homework, played games, and listened to their stories, they began to warm up to him. One little girl about Mia's age approached Sebastian hesitantly. "Can you help me with my drawing?" she asked, holding up a colorful piece of paper. Sebastian's heart melted. "Of course," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. As he spent more time with the children, Sebastian felt something change inside him. He saw their innocence, their hopes, and their fears. He realized that these were the same children he had sworn to protect and serve, but had often viewed with suspicion instead. The experience was humbling. Sebastian found himself looking forward to his time at the center, cherishing the smiles and laughter of the kids. He began to see beyond badges and uniforms, recognizing the humanity in every person he met. One day, as Sebastian was leaving the center, he overheard a conversation between two mothers. "I can't believe that's the same officer who arrested little Mia," one whispered. "I know," the other replied. "He seems different now, like he's really trying to change." Sebastian felt a mix of shame and hope wash over him. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in his career, he felt a genuine desire to be better, not just as a police officer, but as a person. Word of Sebastian's volunteer work at the community center began to spread throughout the neighborhood. People whispered about the change they saw in the once rigid police officer, now spending his days helping children with their homework and playing basketball in the center's small courtyard. One afternoon, as Ben was leaving his office, he bumped into Maria, a longtime friend and fellow community activist. She greeted him with a warm smile, but there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "Ben, have you heard about Officer Sebastian?" Maria asked gently. Ben's jaw tightened. "What about him?" he replied, his voice sharp. Maria took a deep breath. "He's been volunteering at the community center. I've seen him there myself. He seems different." Ben shook his head, his eyes clouding with anger and pain. "People don't change that quickly, Maria. Not after what he did to Mia." "I know, Ben. I understand," Maria said softly. She placed a comforting hand on his arm. "But maybe you should give him a chance to explain himself." Ben pulled away, his emotions conflicting. The memory of Mia's tear-stained face and trembling hands still haunted him. "I don't know if I can do that, Maria. The wounds are still too fresh." As they walked together, Maria continued cautiously. "I'm not saying you have to forgive him, Ben, but hearing him out might help you both move forward." Ben remained silent, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to believe that Sebastian's efforts were sincere, that the man was truly trying to change. But another part, The protective father in him was skeptical. What if this was all just an attempt to repair his public image? "How do I know this isn't just for show?" Ben finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can I trust that he's not just trying to save his career?" Maria squeezed his shoulder gently. "You don't know, Ben. That's why you need to talk to him. See for yourself if his change is genuine." Ben sighed heavily, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of Mia, how she still sometimes woke up crying from nightmares about that day. Could he really face the man responsible for his daughter's trauma? As they reached Ben's car, he turned to Maria. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I can't promise anything. Mia comes first, always." Maria nodded understandingly. "Of course, Ben. Just keep an open mind, okay?" Ben got into his car, his heart heavy with indecision. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the conflicting emotions swirling inside him. The idea of facing Sebastian filled him with dread, but a small part of him wondered if there might be a path forward, a way to heal the deep wounds that had been inflicted on his family and his community. Despite his reservations, Ben finally agreed to meet with Sebastian. They chose a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and potential media attention. As Ben walked in, he spotted Sebastian already seated at a corner table, nervously fidgeting with a paper napkin. Ben approached slowly, his heart pounding. Sebastian stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair in the process. The two men stared at each other for a moment, the tension palpable. "Mr. Ben," Sebastian said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for coming." Ben nodded stiffly and took a seat across from Sebastian. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy. Finally, Sebastian cleared his throat. I want to apologize," he began, his voice shaky. "What I did to your daughter, to you, it was unforgivable." Ben's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on Sebastian. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Sebastian continued, struggling to maintain eye contact. "I've realized how wrong I was, not just that day, but throughout my entire career. I never saw my own biases, never questioned my assumptions." Ben leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" he asked. "To live every day knowing that your child could be hurt, arrested, or worse, just because of the color of her skin?" Sebastian swallowed hard, shaking his head. Ben's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Every time Mia leaves the house, I'm terrified. I've had to teach her how to act around police officers, how to keep her hands visible, how to speak calmly even when she's scared out of her mind. No child should have to learn that, Sebastian." Sebastian listened quietly, his face pale. For the first time, he began to truly understand the depth of the harm he had caused, not just to Mia and Ben, but to countless others throughout his career. "The night after you arrested Mia," Ben continued, his voice thick with emotion, "she woke up screaming from nightmares. She thought the police were coming to take her away again. Do you know what it's like to hold your terrified child and not be able to promise her that it won't happen again?" Sebastian's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm truly, deeply sorry." Ben took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "You're right, it doesn't change what happened, but maybe it's a start." Sebastian and Ben's meeting ended on a somber note. There was no handshake, no promise of future contact, just a quiet nod from Ben as he stood to leave. Sebastian watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and renewed guilt. In the days that followed, Sebastian threw himself into his volunteer work at the community center. He arrived early each morning, helping to set up for the day's activities. The children's laughter echoed through the halls, but Sebastian couldn't help noticing the wary glances from parents and staff. One afternoon, as Sebastian was helping a young boy with his homework, he overheard two mothers talking in hushed tones. "That's him, the cop who arrested that little girl," one whispered. "What's he doing here? Is this some kind of community service?" the other replied. Sebastian's cheeks burned with shame, but he kept his focus on the child in front of him. He knew he couldn't expect instant forgiveness, but the constant reminder of his actions weighed heavily on him. At a community meeting later that week, Sebastian stood up to speak about the importance of building trust between law enforcement and the neighborhood. As he began, he noticed several people turning away or crossing their arms. One man even stood up and walked out. "I know I've made mistakes," Sebastian said, his voice shaky. "I'm here because I want to do better, to be better. I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that." The room remained silent, filled with skeptical faces. Sebastian's words hung in the air, met with neither acceptance nor outright rejection. As the weeks passed, Sebastian's determination didn't waver, but progress was painfully slow. He continued to show up, to listen, and to learn. Some days he felt like he was making a difference. Other days, the weight of his past actions threatened to crush him. One evening, as Sebastian was leaving the community center, he ran into Ben. They both froze, unsure of how to interact outside of their previous meeting. "How's Mia doing?" Sebastian asked hesitantly. Ben's expression softened slightly. She's getting better. The nightmares are less frequent now." Sebastian nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm glad to hear that. I know it doesn't mean much, but I think about her every day." Ben looked at Sebastian for a long moment, then said, "It means something that you're here, trying. It doesn't fix everything, but it's not nothing." With that, Ben walked away, leaving Sebastian standing there, a mix of hope and uncertainty swirling inside him. The path to redemption was long and unclear, but Sebastian knew he had to keep walking it, one small step at a time. Just as Sebastian felt he was making some headway, a devastating blow struck. An anonymous article surfaced online, detailing a past incident where he had wrongfully detained another black family. The story spread like wildfire, reigniting the public's anger and undoing much of the progress Sebastian had made. The community center, once a place of slow but steady acceptance, now felt hostile. Parents pulled their children away when Sebastian approached, and the staff began to question his presence. The whispers behind his back grew louder, and the distrustful glances became outright glares. Sebastian's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Social media was ablaze with renewed outrage. People called for his permanent dismissal from the force, and some even demanded legal action. The weight of his past mistakes felt heavier than ever. One morning, as Sebastian arrived at the community center, he found the doors locked. A note was taped to the entrance. "Due to recent revelations, we are re-evaluating our volunteer program. Please do not return until further notice." Sebastian stood there, staring at the note, feeling a mix of shame and despair. He had worked so hard to make amends, to learn and grow, but it seemed like it was all for nothing. The progress he'd made felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Later that day, Sebastian sat in his living room, scrolling through the endless stream of angry comments online. Each word felt like a dagger, reminding him of his failures. He thought about the family from the newly revealed incident, wondering how they had felt, how their lives had been affected by his actions. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his living room, Sebastian put down his phone and buried his face in his hands. Tears of frustration and regret rolled down his cheeks. He wondered if he would ever be able to move past his mistakes, if redemption was even possible for someone like him. The sound of a car pulling up outside made Sebastian lift his head. Through the window, he saw Ben getting out of his car, a serious expression on his face. Sebastian's heart raced as he stood up, unsure of what this unexpected visit might mean. Sebastian's world crumbled around him as the new scandal erupted. The anonymous article detailing his past misconduct spread like wildfire, and the community that had slowly begun to accept him now turned their backs once again. The progress he had worked so hard to achieve vanished in an instant, leaving him feeling hollow and defeated. At the community center, where Sebastian had found a glimmer of hope and purpose, he now faced cold stares and whispered accusations. Parents hurriedly ushered their children away when they saw him approach. The staff, once cautiously welcoming, now avoided eye contact and kept their distance. One particularly painful afternoon, The center's director pulled Sebastian aside. With a pained expression, she explained that due to mounting pressure from concerned parents and community leaders, they had to put his volunteer work on hold indefinitely. Sebastian nodded numbly, understanding the decision, but feeling the sting of rejection nonetheless. As he walked out of the center for what might be the last time, Sebastian's shoulders slumped under the weight of his guilt and shame. The faces of the children he had grown to care for flashed through his mind, along with the realization that he might never see them again. The thought pierced his heart, and he struggled to hold back tears as he made his way to his car. At home, Sebastian sank into his couch, surrounded by the deafening silence of his empty house. His phone lay silent too, as friends and acquaintances distanced themselves from the controversy. Even those who had cautiously supported his efforts at redemption now seemed to have disappeared. Sebastian's mind raced with dark thoughts. He questioned whether he truly deserved a second chance, whether his efforts at change were genuine or just a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. The guilt of his past actions, both recent and long buried, weighed heavily on his conscience. As the days passed, Sebastian found himself spiraling into despair. He stopped checking his phone, unable to bear the constant barrage of angry messages and calls for his permanent dismissal from the force. He withdrew from the world, spending his days in a haze of regret and self-loathing. One morning, as Sebastian stared blankly at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he seriously considered giving up on his path to redemption. What was the point, he thought, if every step forward led to 2 steps back? The community's trust seemed irreparably broken, and his own faith in his ability to change wavered. Meanwhile, Ben sat in his office, staring at the news article on his computer screen. The words detailing Sebastian's past misconduct blurred as he leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He couldn't help but feel conflicted about the situation. Over the past few weeks, Ben had quietly observed Sebastian's efforts to make amends. He'd heard whispers of the officer's volunteer work at the community center and his attendance at local meetings. At first, Ben had dismissed these actions as mere attempts to salvage a tarnished reputation. But as time passed, he began to see something more. Ben remembered the look in Sebastian's eyes during their tense meeting, the genuine remorse and the desire to understand. It was a far cry from the arrogant officer who had arrested Mia that fateful day. The memory of his daughter's tear-stained face still made Ben's heart ache, but he found himself wondering if holding on to anger was the right path forward. As a civil rights lawyer, Ben had seen firsthand the damage caused by systemic racism and biased policing, but he had also witnessed the power of education and personal growth. He believed that true change could only come when people were willing to confront their biases and learn from their mistakes. With a heavy sigh, Ben picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger hovered over Sebastian's name. The easy thing would be to let Sebastian face the consequences of his actions alone. But Ben knew that the harder, more meaningful path was to offer a chance at redemption. Before he could second-guess himself, Ben pressed the call button. As the phone rang, he thought about what he would say. How could he express his belief in second chances while still acknowledging the pain Sebastian had caused? The call went to voicemail, and Ben realized that Sebastian was probably avoiding his phone in the wake of the scandal. He took a deep breath and left a message. "Sebastian, it's Ben. I know things are tough right now, but I think we should talk. I've seen the efforts you've been making and, well, I believe people can change. If you're willing to keep doing the work, I'm willing to help. Call me back when you can." As he ended the call, Ben felt a mix of emotions. Part of him still harbored anger and distrust, but another part recognized the importance of forgiveness and healing, not just for Sebastian, but for the entire community. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was committed to being part of the solution. In the days following his phone call to Sebastian, Ben found himself wrestling with a decision that would shock the community. As he stood at the back of the crowded community center, listening to the heated discussions about Sebastian's past and present actions, he knew it was time to speak up. The room fell silent as Ben made his way to the front. Eyes followed him, filled with a mix of respect and curiosity. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he faced the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," Ben began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I know we're all here tonight because we're angry, hurt, and looking for justice, and we have every right to feel that way. He paused, looking around the room. Faces that had been twisted with anger moments ago now showed confusion and interest. But I want to talk about something that might surprise you. I want to talk about redemption. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ben held up his hand, asking for patience. Officer Sebastian's actions were wrong. They caused pain to my family and to our community. But I've seen something in recent weeks that's made me think. I've seen a man trying to change, trying to understand the harm he's caused. Ben's words hung in the air. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, intrigued. We often talk about wanting to see change in our society, in our police force. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people are given the chance to learn, to grow, to do better. He took another deep breath before continuing. I believe Sebastian deserves that chance. Not because what he did wasn't serious, but because his efforts to make amends are sincere. By allowing him to continue this journey, we open the door for real, lasting change. The room erupted in a mix of reactions. Some people nodded in agreement, while others shouted in disbelief. Ben raised his voice slightly to be heard over the commotion. I know this isn't easy to hear. Believe me, I struggled with this decision. But if we want to build a better community, we need to be willing to have difficult conversations. We need to be open to the possibility of transformation. As Ben finished speaking, the room buzzed with intense discussion. People turned to their neighbors, debating the merits of his words. Some approached Ben, eager to understand more about his change of heart. In that moment, Ben realized he had opened the door to a new kind of dialogue. Instead of focusing solely on punishment and blame, people were beginning to talk about healing and reconciliation. It was a small step, but an important one. Sebastian sat in the back of the community center, his heart pounding as he listened to Ben's words. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man he had wronged so deeply was now standing up for him, talking about redemption and second chances. Tears welled up in Sebastian's eyes as the weight of this moment hit him. After the meeting, Sebastian approached Ben with trembling hands. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't deserve this, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make it right. Ben nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. Make sure you do, he said. In the days that followed, Sebastian returned to the community center. At first, people were wary, keeping their distance. But Sebastian didn't let it discourage him. He threw himself into his work with a new sense of purpose. He started by helping out with the after-school program. Sebastian read stories to the younger kids, his voice gentle and patient as he answered their endless questions. With the older children, he helped with homework, discovering a knack for explaining math problems in a way that made sense. As the weeks passed, Sebastian noticed a change. The kids started to warm up to him, greeting him with smiles and high fives when he arrived. Parents who had once glared at him now nodded in acknowledgement. One day, while helping to organize a community cleanup event, Sebastian found himself working alongside Minda, a mother whose son attended the center's programs. You know, Minda said as they picked up litter in the park, I didn't think I'd ever say this, but I'm glad you're here. Sebastian looked at her, surprised. Really? Maria nodded. My son, Carlos, he talks about you all the time. Says you make math fun. She paused, then added, It's good for him to see that people can change. Sebastian felt a lump in his throat. Thank you, he said softly. That means more than you know. As time went on, Sebastian's role at the center grew. He started a mentoring program for teenagers interested in law enforcement, but with a focus on community engagement and understanding racial biases. He shared his own experiences openly, using his mistakes as teachable moments. Through it all, Sebastian never forgot why he was there. This wasn't about erasing his past or making himself feel better. It was about learning, growing, and working to make things right. Every smile from a child, every word of thanks from a parent reminded him of the responsibility he carried. Sebastian's journey of redemption took an unexpected turn as he found himself becoming an advocate for police reform. His experiences had opened his eyes to the deep-rooted issues within law enforcement, and he felt compelled to share his story with others. One day, Sebastian received an invitation to speak at a training seminar for new police recruits. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for the job. But with encouragement from Ben and the community center, he decided to take the opportunity. Standing in front of a room full of fresh-faced recruits, Sebastian took a deep breath. "I'm here today to tell you about the biggest mistake of my career," he began, his voice shaky but determined. He recounted the incident with Mia, not sparing any details about his own biases and misjudgments. As he spoke, Sebastian could see the impact his words were having on the young officers. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable, but all were listening intently. He explained how his unchecked biases had nearly destroyed his career and, more importantly, had caused real harm to innocent people. "It's not enough to say we're not racist," Sebastian told them. "We have to actively work to recognize and overcome our biases every single day." After the seminar, several recruits approached Sebastian to thank him for his honesty. One young woman, her eyes filled with tears, said, "I never thought about it like that before. Thank you for opening my eyes." Encouraged by the positive response, Sebastian began speaking at more training events and community meetings. He shared his story with seasoned officers, community leaders, and anyone who would listen. Each time he spoke, he felt a little bit of the weight he'd been carrying lift from his shoulders. At one community event, Sebastian found himself face to face with a group of skeptical residents. One man stood up, his voice filled with anger. "How can we trust that you've really changed?" he demanded. Sebastian paused, considering his words carefully. "You're right to be skeptical," he said. "I can't erase what I did. All I can do is work every day to be better and to help others avoid making the same mistakes I did." His honesty seemed to resonate with the crowd. Slowly, people began to nod, and the tension in the room eased. As Sebastian continued his work, he noticed a shift in the way people responded to him. His journey from disgraced officer to advocate for change was beginning to inspire others. Fellow officers reached out to him, sharing their own struggles and asking for advice. Community members who had once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as an ally in the fight for justice. Ben and Sebastian's unlikely partnership began to take shape as they found common ground in their desire for change. Despite their rocky start, the two men realized that together, they could make a real difference in their community. One sunny afternoon, they met at a local coffee shop to discuss their ideas. Ben, his eyes bright with determination, leaned forward. "Sebastian, I think we have a unique opportunity here. Your experience as a former officer and my legal background could be a powerful combination." Sebastian nodded, a mix of hope and nervousness on his face. "I agree. But how do we start? There's so much mistrust to overcome." Ben thought for a moment. "What if we started with a series of community dialogues, open forums where people can share their experiences and concerns?" The idea took root, and soon Ben and Sebastian were organizing their first community meeting. They chose a neutral location, the local library, and invited residents, police officers, and community leaders to attend. The first meeting was tense. People on both sides were hesitant to speak openly. But as Sebastian shared his story of transformation, and Ben talked about the importance of understanding and forgiveness, the atmosphere began to shift. One elderly woman stood up, her voice quavering. "I've been afraid of the police my whole life," she admitted. "But hearing you two talk, it gives me hope that things can change." Encouraged by the response, Ben and Sebastian organized more meetings. They brought in experts on implicit bias, invited youth to share their perspectives, and facilitated honest discussions about race and policing. Their efforts caught the attention of the police chief, who saw an opportunity for real reform. Together, they developed a new training program for officers, focusing on community engagement and cultural sensitivity. Sebastian took a lead role in the training, using his own experiences to illustrate the dangers of unchecked bias. "I thought I was one of the good ones," he told a room full of officers. "But I had to learn that it's not enough to not be racist. We have to be actively anti-racist." Meanwhile, Ben worked with community organizations to create youth programs that fostered positive interactions between young people and law enforcement. They organized sports leagues, mentoring programs, and community service projects that brought officers and residents together. Slowly but surely, the community began to heal. At a neighborhood block party, children played alongside off-duty officers without fear. Residents felt more comfortable reporting crimes, knowing they would be treated with respect. One day, as Ben and Sebastian watched a group of kids and officers engaged in a friendly basketball game, Ben turned to his unlikely friend. "You know, Sebastian, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you arrested my daughter that day." Sebastian looked shocked. "What? Why?" Ben smiled. "Because if you hadn't, we wouldn't be here now, watching our community come together like this." As the warm sun shone down on the neighborhood park, Mia's laughter filled the air. The little girl, now 6 years old, ran across the grass with her friends, her pigtails bouncing with each step. Her favorite doll, now mended and loved, was clutched tightly in her hand as she played. Ben sat on a nearby bench, his eyes never straying far from his daughter. He watched as Mia climbed the jungle gym, her face beaming with joy and confidence. The sight brought a lump to his throat as he remembered how different things had been just a year ago. The park, once a place of fear and painful memories, had transformed into a haven of happiness and community. Neighbors chatted amiably as they watched their children play. A few off-duty police officers, part of the new community engagement program, tossed a frisbee with some of the older kids. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly neighbor who had witnessed Mia's arrest, approached Ben with a gentle smile. "It's wonderful to see Mia so happy again," she said, settling beside him on the bench. Ben nodded, his eyes glistening. "It is. I wasn't sure we'd ever get back here." As they talked, Mia ran up to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Daddy, look!" she exclaimed, holding up a daisy chain she had made. "It's for you." Ben's heart swelled as he accepted the gift, carefully placing it on his wrist. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you." Mia beamed, then turned to Mrs. Johnson. "I made one for you too," she said, presenting another daisy chain. Mrs. Johnson's eyes welled up as she took the delicate creation. "Oh, Mia, you're such a thoughtful girl. Thank you, dear." As Mia skipped back to her friends, Ben marveled at his daughter's resilience. The trauma of that day had left its mark, but with time, love, and support, Mia had blossomed once again. Her nightmares had subsided, replaced by sweet dreams and the excited chatter of a child looking forward to each new day. The community had rallied around them, creating a protective cocoon of love and understanding. Neighbors kept a watchful eye out for each other's children, and the new police initiatives had begun to bridge the gap between law enforcement and residents. Ben watched as Mia joined a group of children gathered around Officer Rodriguez, who was showing them how to make paper airplanes. The sight of his daughter interacting so comfortably with a police officer filled Ben with a mixture of pride and hope for the future. As the afternoon wore on, the park remained a bustling center of activity. Families picnicked on checkered blankets, the aroma of homemade treats wafting through the air. The sound of children's laughter mingled with the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Ben stood up, stretching his legs. He walked over to where Mia was playing and crouched down beside her. "Having fun, sweetie?" he asked, ruffling her hair affectionately. Mia nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Daddy. Can we stay a little longer?" "Of course we can," Ben replied, his heart full of gratitude for this moment of pure joy. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Sebastian stood at the edge of the playground. He watched Mia from afar, her joyful laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. His heart swelled with a mixture of emotions, regret for his past actions, but also a profound sense of peace and purpose. Mia's pigtails bounced as she chased after a colorful ball, her face lit up with pure, unbridled happiness. Sebastian couldn't help but smile, remembering how different things had been just a year ago. The sight of her playing freely without fear or hesitation was a powerful reminder of the change that had taken place. As he observed the scene before him, Sebastian felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. The journey that had brought him to this moment had been long and challenging, filled with moments of doubt and self-reflection. But standing here now, watching the community come together in harmony, he knew that every step had been worth it. The park buzzed with activity. families picnicking, children playing, and neighbors chatting amicably. Sebastian noticed a few of his fellow officers engaged in friendly conversations with community members, a sight that would have been unimaginable in the past. The barriers that had once divided them were slowly crumbling, replaced by understanding and mutual respect. Sebastian's gaze returned to Mia, who was now showing her friends how to make daisy chains. He marveled at her resilience and capacity for forgiveness. Her ability to heal and find joy again had been a constant source of inspiration throughout his own journey of redemption. As he stood there, Sebastian felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He knew that his journey was far from over. There was still much work to be done, both within himself and within the community. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. The ripples of change that had started with his decision to confront his biases and seek understanding had grown into a wave of healing that touched every corner of the community. Sebastian understood now that his story was not just about personal redemption, but about the power of compassion and forgiveness to transform an entire community. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Sebastian, Ben, and Mia, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.